everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Black Tech Unplugged. I am joined by Joe Miller today. Hey, Joe, how's it going?
Deena, how are you?
I'm doing well. It is the end of August, and we're going into our new month tomorrow, so that's exciting.
It is. Oh, I feel like I'm getting too. It's just the years get shorter and shorter.
Yes, that is very true. But yes, it is exciting. And Joe, for my listeners who might not be familiar with you, I want to take a moment and have you introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Joe Miller. I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called the Washington Center for Technology Policy Inclusion, Washington, and our mission is to fight for safe and more informed internet by teaching tech law and policy to everyone who wants to shape it.
Excellent. And we are going to dig more into that actually right now. So want to start with what is Washington Tech? You explained it a little bit there, but want to go into more details, what it is exactly and what you're teaching individuals in regards to tech policy as well as tech safety.
So the wonky term for what we do is civic engagement. So before the internet and before we were able to set up platforms, most of the tech policy and telecommunications and media policy debates that were happening in Washington were kind of limited to Washington. And, there was a little bit of engagement, but you had to go physically to communities to meet with communities to educate them on what was happening with things like media ownership by women and people of color, broadband build out to remote areas, and issues like that. Now we're able to reach people on a much wider scale. At the same time, in Washington, the culture has been to exclude marginalized voices from a lot of these debates. And for decades, people of color and women fought for, quote unquote, a seat at the table. And, right now it's time to go beyond a seat at the table, and it's time to make money like the lobbyists do. So what we try to provide is a platform where folks are going to have their voices heard, have their research disseminated to a wider audience, so they can drive more traffic to their own site, to their own work, help make a name for themselves, and at the same time influence public policy debate here in Washington. The second piece is empowering communities to engage locally on issues related to, first thing that comes to mind is education policy. And so we want to teach folks issues around privacy and what schools are doing with their kids' data, for example, things they may not know about, or different platforms that school districts partner with to deliver remote education tools to students. We want to provide information to the public so that they're aware of what's happening and so that they can advocate locally, whether it's through their school or through their PTAs, just so they have a sense of what's going on. For example, if a school district here in Fairfax County uses a platform called Schoology, but the only thing that governs the relationship between Fairfax County Public Schools and Schoology is terms of service agreement. But what we don't know is, what is the ongoing monitoring? Does Fairfax County Public School keep tabs to make sure that Schoology isn't selling our kids' data? What are they doing with our kids' data? These are things that parents need to be aware of that are happening locally that can affect their kids down the road. One example that I've talked about a lot is the example in Florida of a school district that was sending school discipline data to the police department, and the police were using it to predict future criminality. So we have a lot of these, education and combined with surveillance issues that folks need to know about in their communities so they can advocate locally and then also support their representatives and engage more with their representatives in a more informed way. So that's our mission, is twofold. We want to get the best scholars and the best minds to a wider public, and then at the same time, we want the public to be empowered to advocate in their own communities.
Yes, and Joe, let's touch on that example that you provided. So the school was providing discipline notes basically to police officers, and what did they want the end result of that to be?
It's hard to say. We know throughout history the end result was to lock people of color up.
Right.
Um, and this is Florida, so you never
Right.
know what's going on. Where you're not based in Florida, are you?
No, no,
Okay,
not
good. So I
based in
can talk
Florida.
about Florida. I don't know what's in the water down there, but no, all respect to Florida, beautiful state. I love Miami. That's about it. No, I'm just kidding. Florida's a great state. Orlando is great. Uh, but yes, I don't know what the police were intending to do with it, but they have a lot of these police departments. uh, You know, it's. I don't want to say it's a slippery slope uh, between surveillance and the need to capture criminals, but it kind of is. But sometimes they go too far, with these things.
Mm-hmm.
They collect the data and then nobody knows what they're going to do with it. And so that's the kind of thing that parents need to advocate locally, that if the police are going to do things like that, they should push back against it, um, so that the end result and that the policy that governs how police departments do that, utilize this data, has been informed by due process and getting input from the public before they just go ahead and start partnering with school districts without any oversight from the public at all.
Yes, and you mentioned that washing tech is a two-prong approach. I want to stay on the local perspective in regards to teaching folks around privacy. And you gave that example, but want to just ask if there's maybe two or three other examples that you have that are very common that you see across multiple states in regards to teaching folks around privacy.
I don't have any other examples off the top of my head, so I don't know if we should do that one.
Okay.
We have the Ring camera surveillance. And
Mm-hmm.
that's, again, another area where, we have examples of it being effective and useful.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we have to continue to ask at what cost.
Right.
Over the last couple of days, we saw that a Ring camera caught a child molester grabbing a 7-year-old, and
Mm-hmm.
touching her in an inappropriate way. The Ring camera caught that. But at the same time, we just have sort of a general surveillance, warrantless surveillance with these cameras. And so there's a constant, struggle between how are these cameras going to be used by local police departments, and how are they going to engage the public in the process of developing the policies that govern those relationships between police departments and, in this case, Amazon, when they're surveilling these communities. There's a big issue around these proprietary agreements between police departments and companies like Ring and Amazon, and what they're doing with this information. And if it's proprietary, then no one can disclose what they're doing. And so that comes up against due process, and it's something that uh, local communities should push back on, with the awareness that it can be effective, as we saw in the case I just described with the criminal who assaulted the little girl. You may have to edit this. I have to think of another example. It's not coming to me right away. I'm glad this isn't live.
No worries. But I do want to talk about the other prong or the other half of what the work that you're doing, and that's around tech policy work. And so, first question I have around that is, for people who are not really familiar with tech policy, what is technology policy?
So technology policy has to do with the relationship between technology companies and the public, and what kind of oversight the government should have on those companies in those relationships in a market-based economy. So traditionally, it goes all the way back to the early 20th century with the Communications Act of 1934, which governed electronic media and media ownership and First Amendment. And so fast forward to today, we're dealing with the same kinds of issues around misinformation, disinformation, who controls the platforms that we were dealing with back then. The only issue is that these the platforms are privately owned as opposed to broadcast, where they were owned by the public with public broadcast spectrum. And so technology policy deals with how the federal government should deal with the interaction between these platforms and the public in light of the First Amendment and in light of privacy issues, in light of speech issues, in light of who owns the platform, who's developing algorithms that decide so much of so much of our daily lives, whether it comes to which algorithm recommends who we should date, to how algorithms are tracking women who now are seeking abortions in a state where it's illegal, and so how should the government deal with those types of issues in an amendment that in an environment that's supposed to be defined by principles that are universal, but which were envisioned in an era where none of these, the founders never even thought of these technologies. And so technology policy and communications policy are sort of combined now into this overall issue of technology policy that deals with media ownership, which you're dealing with broadcast, or you're dealing with private platform ownership, and then First Amendment and whose voices are heard and what the politics are around how those policies are going to be influenced and developed and then implemented.
Yes, and one thing that you mentioned, even just describing technology policy, is misinformation. And as we know, especially given the last couple of years, there's so much misinformation that floats around on the internet. And we see it on all the platforms, from Facebook, Twitter, anything that you can think of. What have you seen from a technology policy standpoint that will help with the misinformation that's out there?
That's a great question. What I've seen, though, is that it's hard to govern in an environment where we have to constantly balance the First Amendment. So what the best approach that I've seen so far is some efforts to inoculate the public against misinformation, help them evaluate what they see and hear. So taking into account, teaching them about fallacies, teaching them about where biases come from, teaching them the difference between misinformation and real information. So it's hard to address through policy, but the platforms themselves, in this case, YouTube is working with researchers at the University of Cambridge to develop technology and to develop a messaging approach that will help inoculate the public against misinformation by, and again, another wonky term is digital literacy, to help folks evaluate the information they see online more effectively. There's a lot of conversation in DC regarding Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which governs how platforms treat third-party content. We wouldn't have the internet that we have today if platforms like Facebook or Twitter or even Zoom were to be liable for the content that you and I produce or that anyone produces. It would simply be too risky. But a lot of folks are twisting it around and using it as a basis to push back against things like platforms that want to act responsibly and combat misinformation through reasonable content moderation policies. And so there's a lot of confusion out there in the political messaging, and it's sort of these red herrings and trying to assert policies that have absolutely nothing to do with content moderation, to try to gaslight the public around what's true and false.
Yes, and I think we can call out the perfect example is when Trump was in office. There was a lot of misinformation that was floating around, or even before that election, and even before with Trump versus Biden, there was a lot of misinformation, and there's still misinformation out there today. So there's a lot of work I think that needs to go into that, but I'm hoping in the future it gets a little better, because for me, I was on the cusp of, well, I shouldn't say on the cusp. I've seen where, you had to really do research when you spoke about something in the past, versus now everything is at your fingertips. Everything is digital. You can have it immediately, but it could be wrong. And it's like the old fashioned saying of like, well, Google it. But now if you Google it, that misinformation is popping up. So I'm intrigued to see what direction all of this goes in the next couple of years.
Yeah, another challenge is that more and more platforms in this, because there's so much demand for content, are relying on algorithms to actually write the content. And if you don't have folks who are skilled to evaluate what those algorithms are spitting out, then your platforms are going to be more inclined to just post, whatever these, AI is determined is an appropriate piece of content in response to particular keywords. And so that's another issue that warrants investigation.
Yeah, and let's just speaking on the AI piece. I know that some of your work has included AI and machine learning and how that's affecting people like myself and even your own family. So why don't we talk through that a little bit, actually, and just like what your experience has been and what are some examples that you worked on that you can share.
Well, there were a lot of issues around algorithmic bias. The first thing that comes to mind is credit reporting agencies using algorithms to determine, whether tenants, for example, will be given a lease,
Yeah.
based on factors that are biased, things that have absolutely nothing to do with whether they're going to pay rent in the future, such as whether they have a criminal record and things like that. There are issues around the way healthcare uses algorithms to determine if marginalized groups should receive treatment. But algorithms have been around for a long time. They just haven't necessarily been on the internet. I mean, what is U.S. News and World Report's algorithm? Nobody knows, but it's been used for decades and decades. Recently, Columbia University was unranked by U.S. News and World Report because U.S. News and World Report claims that they don't have the ability to evaluate all the information that these universities are sending them. Well, how can they have a ranking if they can't peer review it?
Right.
So we've always had algorithms and algorithmic bias that affect outcomes for particular groups. And let me tell you, we have a lot of talk about repaying student loans, and we have a lot of talk about, reimbursing kids who attend for-profit colleges. Well, there are a lot of folks who can't attend elite universities because of these biased algorithms that are in place. One example being U.S. News Report, another example, of course, being standardized testing that have held people back for years. And then the students who do go there get charged unless they make unless their families make below a certain amount. At least that's what they tell us, that kids can go to school for free, irrespective of their household income. But these schools have a long history of discriminating against people of color and pushing, theories like measuring people's skulls and things like that. I mean, this was research that came out of these places.
Yeah.
Biased algorithms and pseudoscience that came out of these places. So we've been dealing with algorithms and biased algorithms and algorithms that have no basis in science since the beginning of time.
And you know
Brown
what?
paper bag test was an algorithm. So it's just scaled up through the internet. Now it's able to be done on a much larger scale than it was before.
And you know what? You keep using the word algorithm, and I think it would be good for, especially someone listening to the podcast. A lot of times, everyone's thinking of algorithm just using Instagram because that's the most popular version of, like, for instance, with the Reels situation. If you're not creating Reels, then the algorithm is going to send your post to the back of the line because they want you to use these Reels. But in the way that you're using algorithm, I believe is a little bit different. So let's just define algorithm for anyone listening to the podcast.
So that is an example of an algorithm. That is a bias determining who gets to the top. Just like the ones I've already mentioned determine who gets a lease, who gets a loan to own a home, who gets to go to Harvard, which school is going to be at the top of the U.S. News and World Report, which videos are going to be at the top of someone's Instagram feed. So these really are all algorithms, and these algorithms are fed into artificial intelligence based on criteria that are defined by human beings. And so whenever you see ranking, the first synonym that should come to mind is bias, because whenever you have a ranking, there's going to be some kind of a bias, whether you're looking at restaurant rankings, where they say that Michelin ratings determine what's a great restaurant.
Right.
Okay, why?
Mm-hmm.
Who decided that? A tire company? Okay. And so anytime you hear rankings, there should be some consideration regarding algorithmic bias and the extent to which it plays a role.
And to stay on the same topic around technology policy, there aren't a lot of people who mention that is their job or that's what they get involved in. So how did you get involved with doing tech policy?
Well, I fell into it, really.
Okay.
I started out wanting to own my own radio station. That's all I wanted to do when I was much younger. I just wanted to have a radio station where I wanted to play music, and but the landscape has changed. That's why I decided to become a lawyer, because I wanted to advance through the ranks of owning my own station. Now I have my own platform, of course, but it's a lot different than I envisioned. I never had to apply for a broadcast license, thank goodness. And when I moved to Washington, it's a whole different industry. And so then it became a question of combining my experience working on the station's level in New York, and then combining that with the legal training that I got in New York, after seeing that it was going to be a lot different trying to advance through traditional media companies than I thought, for various reasons. DEI is an issue that we can talk about, but the technology changed and the policies changed. So I mentioned before about the way media policy used to focus on station ownership. Now it's focused on what platforms are doing, and these platforms that are privately owned. And so it's just sort of flowed naturally, following what the debates are here in Washington, starting with net neutrality and now moving up through algorithmic bias, misinformation, disinformation. These are all things, again, that have been going on for a long time. It's just a different context now.
Yeah, and actually I want to go back and touch on net neutrality, because remember back when it happened a couple of years ago, everyone was screaming about it. We were all making a big deal around it. Do you know what the current status is just around net neutrality and any advancements or changes that they've made?
Well, nothing's going to happen with net neutrality until they have a fifth commissioner, and so it's just kind of a wait and see. It's hard to say what's going to happen with net neutrality because of the court's decision in this matter, and some of the issues around that. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen to net neutrality. There are specialists in net neutrality who have been doing this for a long time, who would be more qualified than I am to talk about where we stand. But it's going to be. I'm so tired of going back to that. But it all comes back to agency deference, what's called the Chevron doctrine, and the extent to which courts are going to defer to agency decisions. So what I can say is that any next iteration of net neutrality at the FCC will have to be done in light of the DC Circuit, which decided to uphold the FCC's decision to overturn its own net neutrality policy under Ajit Pai. And so somebody's going to have to figure out how to develop a net neutrality framework that withstands, sort of these political winds.
Okay. And also, Joe, you mentioned that for you took the law route, so you have that's the policy side for you. But what interests you from the tech side? What made you want to make an impact there?
Money.
Okay.
So I run a nonprofit, but it's not non-revenue. And so what we need to do is we need to figure out who wants to support the work that we're doing. And right now it's a question of informing the public around issues in a way that's important to them, not in a way that's driven by politicians in Washington. And that's how we keep the lights on, basically. And that's how Washington works. And now it's a question of, now I'm an entrepreneur, and how to navigate that in a place like Washington, where everything is governed by the credibility of a person's voice and the extent to which they are speaking truth and really trying to reach the public in a way that's meaningful and in a way that makes sense, but at the same time bringing a lot of different stakeholders to the table who the public sees as trustworthy. And that's kind of the fine line, is that everyone is motivated by money, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit. And so the responsibility of nonprofits is to sacrifice the profit motive, to sacrifice the tendency that private corporations have to just have a pure profit focus and not necessarily care about the social impact. We're more of a social enterprise where we try to raise as much money as we can for our mission, but it's got to be focused on creating real value for the public.
Okay. And Joe, you took an atypical route to get to tech policy. You weren't in tech beforehand and eventually went to law school. But if someone's listening to this episode, because tech policy is not a common role that individuals take, what would you recommend, or what tips or advice do you have for them so that they can get into that particular focus or arena?
So first of all, you don't have to be a lawyer. That's the first thing. That's probably the worst thing to do, because the law school environment is terrible. There's something wrong with law schools. So you can pursue a PhD and work on research. You can be a psychologist who works on issues related to how the internet affects teens. They can become a subject matter expert on these issues. You can be an educator. You can get an ED that in a way that focuses on the effect of technology on children. So there are a lot of different approaches to the field that don't involve becoming a lawyer. One of the things that folks in Silicon Valley like to say is that there aren't enough technologists working on policy, and that the people working on policy in DC don't know what they're talking about. Well, the same thing can be said of technology companies who don't have any civil rights lawyers or psychologists or teachers working there to develop the algorithms. And so I think there's going to be a lot of discussion around what exactly does it mean to be a technologist, and how much should we really be emphasizing technical skills? Are we giving too much weight to those technical skills? I think we are. And so then it becomes a question of bringing these other disciplines into the conversation. And so liberal arts graduates are going to be super important to that. I would still recommend some sort of technical expertise if you're going to pursue a liberal arts degree or a liberal arts master's program or PhD. I do recommend having some kind of technical proficiency, whether it's the first thing that comes to mind is a boot camp where you can get certified for becoming a front end developer or things like that. I have friends who have done that. I have lawyer friends who have done that. I have friends who have gone into cybersecurity, and so there should be a combination of technical and liberal arts, more so than one or the other, if that makes sense. And I don't think it should be a minor. I think if you're in undergrad, then you should probably do a double major in a liberal arts and a technical field. That would be my advice.
And let's just use like myself as an example. I've been in tech over 10 years. So obviously I have some experience more so on the non-technical side, but I've still seen how it can affect like Black people or people of color. And I want to get involved in tech policy. I want to make a change. I want to impact. What could someone like myself do? Get involved?
What was your undergrad in? Computer science?
My undergrad was in information systems, so computers and business.
So computers and business. Mm-hmm. So is public policy, you would want to, so the first question is, do you want to work for your local government? So if you work in local government, you can become a technologist for your school district. You might want to look into doing some kind of looking into the surveillance aspect of local law enforcement and bringing some sort of social justice skills to bear on that, if you're given the opportunity. If you want to work on the state level, you can pursue opportunities in the state legislature by finding the committees that deal with local technology related public policy, primarily privacy. More so than speech, because a lot of states are enacting privacy laws now, and there's going to be a lot of issues around conflict of laws between the federal privacy policy that's currently moving through Congress and state policies in places like California and Colorado and Virginia and some other states. There is issue there. If you want to work in business, I would suggest pursuing something along the lines of cybersecurity certification. There's a CISSP. Volunteering would be an interesting route. If you want to work in Washington, there's a particular way, tried and true method. You work at an agency like the FCC or the FTC or the Department of Commerce, NTIA, and then you punch that hole on the ticket. Then you work on the Hill on one of the committees, or you work for someone who work a member of the Commerce Committee, punch that ticket. And then if you want to work in public policy, then that's when you apply to the different companies to work as a public policy manager, or depending on where you ranked in the administration or on the Hill, as a senior advisor for public policy at one of the companies. So would you want to move to DC, or would you rather just deal working on business and having your own platform?
I think that's a very good question that I don't know if I have the answer to right now. I would say, if you ask me, like current day, I would not be moving to DC, so I would want to stay in the Chicago area, which is where I am now, but work on policy.
I think that's a great call. I would love to live in Chicago. I love Chicago.
Yes,
Um,
Chicago is a great, and it's becoming after like pre-pandemic, it was building up. Then obviously COVID hit, but it's on the up and up again, which is always great to see.
and there's also a lot of venture capital activity going on in
Yes,
Chicago right now.
yes, yes,
So
a
that,
lot of it.
and a lot of those VCs are looking to invest in folks who want to create platforms um, that address uh, the historic lack of representation of diverse voices in traditional media. I mean, you have Twitter, which is on the progressive side, where I mean, there's no shortage of diverse voices there, but who's making money off of it?
Mm,
You know, I saw
that's a good
somewhere that
question.
most creators who are prominent are. I hear that most there's something like 50 million creators now, and it's hard to say how many are making money. But I saw somewhere that most of them make less than $1,000 from their content. And so, how do we create opportunities again, going all the way back um, to media ownership? How do we create these kinds of opportunities when we don't have inherited wealth?
Yes, yes, that is definitely true. Also, want to touch back on that piece that you mentioned around cybersecurity, because that is a very big deal these days. Because how many times have we seen a company have security issues? And been a lot of leaks and everything. And so I think cybersecurity is going to be a big tech topic that we cover for the next couple of years, because there's so much that goes on from a security perspective, and there's so many people who are needed from a cybersecurity perspective.
Absolutely, and it's not. It's the one caveat that I have is these technology companies for people of color are just, from what I hear from my friends and colleagues, they seem to be just absolute brutal places to work. But the remunerative potential is there. My good friend Camille Stewart, who used to work at Google and was their head of cybersecurity or something, I forget her exact title. Now she's working in government. Um, she's a prominent figure, and so that's someone whose model I think one would want to emulate. But like I said, these look at the requirements for obtaining a CISSP or any of these cybersecurity certificates and pursue those. It's going to be a lot of work, but I'm sure you'll be satisfied with the end result once you get that cybersecurity job, because everyone's looking for cybersecurity folks these
Yes,
days.
yes, definitely. And Joe, we've talked a lot about tech policy, but I do want to switch gears a tiny bit just to end our conversation today. And when I say switch gears, you talked about your broadcasting background, but for the listeners who might not know, you too are a fellow podcaster, and you have the Washington Tech Policy Podcast. So tell my listeners about that and what you cover on the podcast.
Right. So Tech Policy Leaders is the main platform. Thank you for asking. Tech Policy Leaders is the podcast. You can find it at techpolicypodcast.org. And we feature, those voices that traditionally very brilliant voices that aren't as part of the debate in Washington as they should be. And so since 2015, we've been bringing in scholars and lawyers and folks from across the spectrum, entrepreneurs, to talk about issues related to how technology policy affects their work and how their work is intended to affect privacy policy and misinformation policy. So I encourage you to listen to it. We've had experts on there, MacArthur, who's now a MacArthur Fellow. We've had Danielle Citron, who became a MacArthur Fellow, Alondra Nelson, who headed up OSTP, which is a technology wing of the White House. So we've had Renee DiResta on the show, who predicted the misinformation and disinformation, what she termed blitzkrieg at the time situation that we have now. So it's worth a listen. And again, it's something you can find at techpolicypodcast.org.
Great. And what's one of the most memorable episodes that you've had of your podcast?
Oh, one of the most memorable episode. Oh, man, that's hard to say because then I have to play favorites.
Or maybe what's a reoccurring theme that you've seen threaded through all of the podcasts that you've recorded thus far?
The main theme is this, this misinformation, misinformation and online safety. Those are the things that keep coming up.
And we've talked about it a little bit, but do want to just make sure I give my listeners some tangible tips around that. So let's start with misinformation online. And we've talked about it in regards to knowing how to make sure that you're reading the right resources and that they're reputable and everything else. But is there anything that we've missed from a tips or advice standpoint for misinformation?
Tips or advice for misinformation. You got it. First of all, the prominent news sites like the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, these are all credible sources of news. So I would recommend to anybody that they continue to rely on those. Continue to build up your capacity locally to have local media outlets, so that you're not just getting the national perspective, you're also getting a perspective of how these issues affect you locally and what's going on in your local legislatures and your local administrative agencies. These are a lot of things we don't hear about. We only hear about them if they're picked up in the regional sections of the national newspapers. There are telltale signs of misinformation. Study what the logical fallacies are, and apply those things to what you hear and see online. So this digital literacy thing is something that we all can do to evaluate what we see and hear, and tell the difference between hyperbole and fact, and opinion and fact. Something we should have learned in second grade, but somehow we forgot along the way.
That's so true. So true. And what about from the perspective of keeping your family or yourself safe while you're online? So that could be like content creation or just any way that you interact online. How can my listeners keep themselves safe from that perspective?
So we have a checklist that helps parents protect their kids online. We also have a webinar that talks about what's happening in tech policy and the context for what we're dealing with when it comes to kids' online safety. And you can find the checklist at protectyourkids.online. And in there, you'll find out what you can do with your parental controls, what you can do with your location settings to sort of get a start on protecting your kids online. Really, that's kind of the first step in staying informed in a consistent way, to stay on top of quote unquote technology policy related issues, so that for yourself, and you develop your own instincts about what's right for your family. And again, the starting point for that is our checklist. You can find that at protectyourkids.online.
Excellent. Thank you for that resource. I know that people are going to take you up on that and get that checklist. And Joe, we've covered a lot today, from tech policy, your podcast, and other helpful information. But I want to open the floor to you. Is there anything that you want to share with my listeners in regards to any of those topics, or anything we haven't covered? And now is your chance to do that.
Sure. This is a difficult time. I mean, during World War II, we were only worried about leaflets, propaganda being distributed from airplanes. Now, rogue regimes and insurgents like the ones we saw storm the Capitol still have the ability to disseminate misinformation, disinformation, hate speech and insurrectionist materials at light speed. And so I encourage everyone to do what they can to make sure that they're evaluating information in a way that makes sense, and that's able to call it, that's able to flag BS on your own. You can find, in terms of where you can find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or Instagram, and my handle is Joe Miller JD, JoeMillerJD. And yeah, just once you download the checklist, you'll automatically join our mailing list, and I'll keep in touch with you there too and share the latest research on these things so you can stay on top of it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Joe. I'm sure the listeners will appreciate all the tips and advice, and anyone who's interested in tech policy, now you have some people that will start participating in that. So thank you for sharing your expertise, your career, as well as your website for parents who want to keep their children safe online.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Deena, and take care, everybody. Take care. Stay safe and stay informed.
Yes, yes. All right.
I can make my world come true. All my dreams will see me through. And if that will get me down, my dreams will turn things all around. With a smile upon my face, I can see a better place. Doesn't matter what blow. I can